keys clattered against the mahogany desk, breaking the dead silence of the penthouse office. Chastity didn't look up from her glowing monitor. She knew the heavy measured footsteps pacing the floorboards. Gabriel stopped. The air shifted, suddenly becoming too thick to breathe. His gaze dragged up her sheer black stockings, past the plunging neckline of emerald silk she had bought specifically to ruin someone else's night, and finally stopped at her collarbone. "Where are you going in that dress?" he snapped. Paperwork was the real currency of the underworld. Not shipping containers full of contraband, not hollow-point bullets, and certainly not the physical stacks of cash that rotted in damp duffel bags hidden beneath floorboards. It was ink. It was offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and real estate tax loopholes. Chastity Morales managed all of it. For 3 years, Chastity had occupied the desk just outside Gabriel Mercer's office. She was the gatekeeper, the accountant, the firewall between a brutal man and a society that demanded a veneer of civility. She knew the exact ratio of cream to coffee he preferred on mornings following a shipment delay. She knew the names of the aldermen on his payroll. She also knew exactly how to stitch a laceration so it wouldn't scar, a skill she had acquired on a particularly messy Tuesday in November, when Gabriel had stumbled through her door smelling of copper and cheap whiskey. She was indispensable, and she was completely suffocatingly invisible to him as anything other than an extension of his own left hand. Until today. The clock on the wall read 5:45 p.m. The rest of the legitimate administrative staff had cleared out an hour ago, leaving the 32nd floor of the Mercer Holdings building, wrapped in the quiet hum of the HVAC system. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a sprawling canvas of grey concrete and gridlocked traffic, the fading winter sun casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement. Chastity saved the encrypted spreadsheet she was working on, closed her laptop, and stood up. She didn't reach for her usual beige trench coat or the sensible wool slacks she wore like armor. Instead, she walked to the executive washroom with a black garment bag draped over her arm. When she emerged 15 minutes later, she left Chastity, the secretary, behind. The dress was emerald green silk. It didn't hug her curves so much as it poured over them like liquid glass, cut low in the back to expose the sharp line of her spine, and held up by straps so thin they looked like a dare. She had paired it with black stiletto heels that echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. She swiped a deep crimson lipstick across her mouth, the color of dried blood, and let her hair down from its severe bun, allowing it to fall in loose, dark waves over her bare shoulders. She walked back to her desk to retrieve her clutch. The heavy oak door to Gabriel's inner office swung open. Gabriel Mercer stepped out, rubbing the back of his neck, a half-lit cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. He wore his usual uniform, a bespoke charcoal suit, the jacket discarded somewhere inside his white dress shirt, rolled up to the elbows, to reveal the sprawling ink of a swallow in flight on his left forearm. His tie was loose, his dark hair a messy sweep from running his hands through it in frustration. "Chastity called Tommy, and tell him the docs are—" He stopped. The sentence died in his throat. The cigarette dropped from his lips, bouncing once on the pristine hardwood, before burning a tiny black scorch mark into the polish. Neither of them moved to put it out. Gabriel stared at her. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a physical weight, a sudden heavy pressure that Chastity felt everywhere his eyes landed. He looked at the heels. He looked at the expanse of pale skin exposed by the slit in the silk. He looked at the way the fabric clung to her hips, and finally his gaze snapped up to her painted mouth. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. "Where are you going in that dress?" he snapped. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its corporate polish, rough with the gravel of the streets he had clawed his way out of. Chastity picked up her clutch, keeping her movements deliberate and slow. She refused to shrink under his glare. She had spent 3 years shrinking. "I have an engagement, Mr. Mercer, an engagement." He repeated the word like it was a foreign language. He took a slow step forward, crushing the smouldering cigarette beneath the heel of his Italian leather shoe. "It's a Tuesday. My calendar is clear for the evening. The offshore transfers are complete, and Tommy already knows about the dock delays. I sent the encrypted text 10 minutes ago." Gabriel took another step. He was a large man, built for violence rather than boardrooms, and he used his physical presence as a weapon. He stopped just inches from her, close enough that she could smell the familiar, intoxicating blend of cedar tobacco and the ozone scent of winter air clinging to his clothes. "Who are you going with?" The question wasn't a request for information. It was an interrogation. Chastity looked up at him, meeting his dark, storm-grey eyes. "That is outside the scope of my employment." Gabriel scoffed a harsh, humorless sound. He reached out his large, calloused fingers, hovering just a fraction of an inch above the bare skin of her shoulder. He didn't touch her. He never touched her, but the heat radiating from his hand sent a shiver down her spine. "You're wearing a dress that costs more than my car, Chastity. You've painted yourself up like a target. In my city. I want to know who is taking you out." "It's a charity gala," she said, her voice steady, despite the frantic beating of her heart against her ribs. "And I am perfectly capable of looking after myself. You sit behind a desk. I sit behind a desk and clean up the blood you track in." She countered her tone, sharpening. She stepped back, breaking the invisible tether between them. "I'm leaving, Gabriel. Good night." She turned and walked toward the elevators. She could feel his eyes boring a hole into her back, tracking the movement of her hips, the sway of the silk. Just as she hit the call button, his voice drifted down the hallway, cold and tight. "If he puts a hand on you that you don't want there, you call me." "Understood." Chastity stepped into the elevator, turning to face him as the stainless steel doors began to slide shut. He was still standing by her desk, perfectly still, looking like a caged animal. "He won't," she said quietly. The doors closed, severing the connection, and Chastity finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The warehouse smelled of brine, rust, and fear. Gabriel sat on a wooden shipping crate, rhythmically bouncing a steel ball bearing in the palm of his right hand. The hollow metallic clack echoed through the cavernous space. 10 yards away, a man knelt on the damp concrete floor, bleeding from a split lip and trembling violently under the watchful eyes of Gabriel's 3 lieutenants. Normally, Gabriel would be laser-focused on this. The kneeling man had attempted to skim 15% off a shipment of untraceable pharmaceuticals moving through Gabriel's port. It was an insult, a breach of respect that required an immediate physical response. But Gabriel couldn't focus. His mind was stuck on a loop of emerald green silk. "Who the hell is she with?" He tossed the ball bearing into the air and caught it. The sharp snap of the metal hitting his palm made the kneeling man flinch. Gabriel didn't even look at him. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glaring brightly in the dim light. No messages. He had half expected Chastity to text him an old habit of checking in, but the screen remained aggressively blank. "Boss!" Tommy, a thick-necked enforcer with a broken nose, shifted uncomfortably. "What do you want us to do with him?" Gabriel sighed, sliding off the crate. He walked over to the bleeding man, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face level with the thief. "You stole from me, Ricky," Gabriel said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "You used my trucks, my routes, and my protection, and then you put your hand in my pocket. I was desperate, Mr. Mercer. Ricky sobbed, spitting a glob of blood onto the concrete. My kid. The medical bills. Gabriel stared at him. He felt nothing. No pity, no anger. Just a hollow, restless irritation that had been crawling under his skin since 5:45 p.m. Break his right hand, Gabriel said to Tommy, standing up and brushing invisible dust from his trousers. If he shows his face near the docks again, break his legs. He didn't wait to hear the wet crunch of bone or the subsequent scream. He turned and walked out of the warehouse, stepping into the freezing night air. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his coat, lighting one with a flick of his silver Zippo. He took a long drag, the nicotine doing absolutely nothing to settle the agitation vibrating in his chest. He pulled his phone out again and dialed a number. It rang twice before a raspy voice answered. Yeah, boss. Mick. You still have eyes on the Waldorf? Gabriel asked, referring to his man stationed near the downtown hotel where half the city's corrupt politicians lived. Yeah. Quiet night. Chastity is at a charity gala there. Find out who she walked in with. There was a brief pause on the line. Mick knew better than to ask questions, but the hesitation spoke volumes. Nobody tracked Chastity. Chastity was the untouchable ghost of the Mercer operation. Give me 5 minutes. Gabriel leaned against the cold steel of his black SUV, staring out at the inky black water of the harbour. The city skyline reflected in the rippling surface a distorted mirror of neon and glass. He closed his eyes, remembering the way she had looked at him in the office. Defiant, unapologetic. He was used to women looking at him with fear or with a calculated greed. Chastity looked at him like he was a math equation she hadn't quite solved, but was entirely unafraid of. She was his tether to humanity. When the violence of his life threatened to drown him, he would return to the quiet sanctuary of his office, listen to the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard, and remember how to breathe. His phone buzzed. He answered it instantly. Well, she's at the Winter Solstice Gala, Mick reported. And boss, she didn't walk in with just anybody. Give me the name, Mick. Linus Romero. The name hit Gabriel like a physical blow to the sternum. The air left his lungs in a sharp, quiet hiss. Linus Romero, the golden boy of the city's oldest crime syndicate. While Gabriel ran the gritty blue-collar underworld of the ports and unions, Romero ran the high-end casinos, the illicit art trade, and the political blackmail rings. Romero was old money, wrapped in designer velvet, a man who smiled while he poisoned your drink. He had been trying to get a foothold in Gabriel's ports for 2 years, and now he had his hands on Chastity. Get the car, Gabriel barked to his driver, tossing his half-smoked cigarette onto the wet asphalt. Where to Mr. Mercer? The Waldorf. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf was a masterclass in opulent excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, covered in Renaissance-style frescoes, casting fractured prisms of light across a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. A string quartet played a hauntingly slow waltz in the corner, the music barely audible over the low-moneyed murmur of the city's elite. Chastity stood near a towering ice sculpture, a crystal flute of champagne warming in her hand. She hadn't taken a single sip. You look 1,000,000 miles away, my dear. Linus Romero materialized beside her, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a man who owned every room he walked into. He was undeniably handsome, blonde hair perfectly swept back, sharp cheekbones, and a tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. He smelled of expensive cologne and power, just admiring the architecture. Chastity lied smoothly, offering him a practiced, polite smile. Linus chuckled, stepping closer. He reached out, resting a hand on the small of her back. The touch was light, but Chastity felt the immediate instinct to pull away. She forced herself to remain still. She had accepted Linus's invitation for a reason. Partially it was to gather intel on his current operations, a preemptive strike to protect Gabriel's assets. But if she was brutally honest with herself, she had accepted because she wanted to be seen. For 3 years she had lived in Gabriel's shadow, a functional piece of furniture in his chaotic life. Tonight, she wanted to exist. "You are the most captivating creature in this room," Linus said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a practiced intimacy. His thumb brushed lightly against the bare silk, covering her spine. "Mercer is a fool to keep you locked away in that ivory tower of his." "I am not locked away, Mr. Romero," Chastity said, her tone cooling slightly. "I work for him. I am not his property." "Of course not," Linus purred, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous amusement. But men like Gabriel Mercer don't understand the difference between employees and possessions. He's a street dog who found a bone. He doesn't know how to appreciate it, but he'll bite anyone who tries to take it. Chastity opened her mouth to retort, to defend Gabriel despite her own frustrations with him, but the words died on her lips. The heavy oak double doors of the ballroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide. The subtle shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate. The polite murmur of conversation stuttered and died, rolling backward from the entrance like a receding tide. The string quartet missed a note, the cellist looking up in alarm. Gabriel Mercer stood in the doorway. He hadn't bothered to change. He was still wearing the charcoal suit from the office, no tie, his collar unbuttoned. His hair was windblown, his jaw tight, and his eyes were a terrifying dead storm cloud grey. He looked entirely out of place among the velvet and lace, a dark, jagged scar across a beautiful painting. Chastity's breath hitched. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He actually came. Gabriel didn't look at the politicians whispering behind their hands, or the socialites staring in thinly veiled horror. His eyes swept the room with military precision, and within 3 seconds they locked onto Chastity. More specifically, they locked onto Linus Romero's hand, resting on Chastity's waist. Gabriel moved. He didn't walk. He stalked. The crowd parted for him, instinctively stepping back to avoid the sheer kinetic force of his anger. He closed the distance across the ballroom in a matter of seconds. "Mercer," Linus said, his voice dripping with condescension, though he didn't remove his hand from Chastity. "I didn't realize you were on the guest list. I thought charity events were a bit refined for your tastes." Gabriel ignored Linus completely. He stopped in front of Chastity, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating off his wool suit. His eyes flicked down to her face, scanning her, checking for what harm. "Get your coat," Gabriel said to her. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a physical command. "Gabriel." Chastity started keeping her voice steady, acutely aware of the 100 pairs of eyes watching them. "You're making a scene." "I don't give a damn about a scene," he replied, his gaze finally shifting to Linus. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Take your hand off her, Romero, before I remove it at the wrist." Linus let out a soft, mocking laugh, but Chastity felt his fingers tighten slightly on her waist. Bold words, Mercer. But Chastity is a grown woman. She accepted my invitation. You don't get to dictate who she spends her time with off the clock. Gabriel tilted his head, a dangerous, razor-thin smile touching the corner of his mouth. You think you brought her here because she likes you. You brought her here to send a message to me, to see if I'd blink. Well, I'm here, Linus. And I'm not blinking. Gabriel took a half step forward, his chest almost touching Linus's. The size difference wasn't massive, but the sheer aura of violence rolling off Gabriel was suffocating. She is not a pawn on your board. You don't get to use her to get to my docks. Now remove your hand." For a long, agonizing second, nobody moved. The air was thick with the promise of bloodshed. Chastity knew Gabriel was armed. She could see the faint outline of his shoulder holster beneath his jacket. She also knew Linus's men were scattered around the room. "Enough," Chastity said sharply. She stepped forward forcefully, pulling out of Linus's grip and placing herself directly between the two men. She looked at Linus, her expression hardened into the mask she wore during hostile negotiations. "Thank you for the champagne, Mr. Romero. But the evening has run its course." Linus's eyes narrowed, the charming facade cracking for just a fraction of a second to reveal the viciousness beneath. "A shame. We were just getting to know each other." He looked at Gabriel. "Watch your back, Mercer. The ports are getting crowded." "I'll keep that in mind," Gabriel said, his voice flat. Without another word, Gabriel grabbed Chastity's hand. His grip was tight, possessive, desperate, and entirely inappropriate for an employer. He didn't drag her, but he pulled her along with an unstoppable momentum, leading her away from the ice sculpture, past the staring crowd, and out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the hotel. He didn't stop until they reached a secluded alcove near the coat check, hidden from the main thoroughfare. He dropped her hand, turning to face her chest heaving as if he had just run a mile. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing 2 steps away, then turning back. He looked infuriated, terrified, and entirely out of control. "What the hell were you thinking?" Gabriel hissed, pointing a finger at her. "Linus Romero. Do you have any idea what that man does to people who get in his way? He's a psychopath, Chastity. He is a business rival." Chastity shot back, matching his volume. She wasn't shrinking. She stepped into his space, her chin raised. "And I was handling it. Handling it. He was practically undressing you in front of half the city. He was trying to get a reaction out of you, and congratulations, Gabriel, you gave him exactly what he wanted. You walked in there looking like a rabid dog and proved to everyone that you have a weak spot." Gabriel froze. The words echoed in the narrow alcove. He stepped closer to her, backing her slowly against the velvet-lined wall. The anger in his eyes fractured, replaced by something much darker, much heavier. He braced one hand on the wall next to her head, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. "You think you're just a weak spot," he whispered, his voice rough, vibrating against her skin. "You think I give a damn about the docks when I saw him touching you? Do you know what I saw when I walked into that room?" Chastity. She couldn't breathe. The scent of him, cedar-cold night air and raw adrenaline, was overwhelming. "No," she breathed out. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there for a devastating second before rising back to meet hers. "I saw a man who was about to die," Gabriel said quietly, with absolute chilling sincerity. "Because he touched what is mine." Chastity's heart stopped. She looked at him, searching his exhausted, beautiful, violent face. "I am not yours, Gabriel," she whispered, her voice trembling, stripping away the armor she had worn for 3 years. "I sit outside your door. I answer your phones." Gabriel reached up his rough fingers, brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he had just promised. "You are the only thing keeping me breathing," he confessed, the words torn from him against his will. "And if you ever wear that dress for another man again, I will burn this city to the ground." Neon signs bled through the tinted windows of the SUV, casting fractured streaks of red and blue across the leather interior. The partition separating the driver from the back seat was raised, sealing Chastity and Gabriel in a soundproof vault of their own making. Silence suffocated the small space. It wasn't the comfortable professional silence they usually shared over profit and loss statements. This silence was radioactive. Gabriel sat rigidly on the far side of the bench, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked relentlessly near his ear. He had poured 2 fingers of amber liquid from the hidden console decanter, but the crystal tumbler just sat untouched in his palm. He was staring out the window at the passing city, yet Chastity knew he wasn't seeing the pedestrians or the gridlocked traffic. He was still in that ballroom. He was still watching Linus Romero's hand, resting against her bare skin. Chastity kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, gripping the edges of her clutch until her knuckles turned white. Her emerald dress, which had felt like a suit of armor just 2 hours ago, now felt impossibly flimsy. The cold from the winter night had seeped into her bones. But the real chill came from the realization of what had just irrevocably shifted. "You gave him leverage," Chastity said softly. She didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead at the black partition. The statement hung in the air, a flat, undeniable fact. Gabriel slowly turned his head. His eyes caught the ambient streetlight flashing a dangerous silver. "I gave him a warning. You gave him a map with a giant red X on it." She corrected her voice, shedding the polished secretary tone she had maintained for years. "Men like Linus Romero don't care about warnings. They care about vulnerabilities. For 3 years, I was a ghost. I was a name on a payroll ledger. Nobody looked at me, because you never looked at me." Gabriel set the glass down in the cup holder with a heavy, deliberate thud. He shifted his weight, closing the distance between them by a fraction, but in the enclosed space, it felt like an avalanche. "I looked at you," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that scraped against her nerves. "Every damn day, Chastity. You think I didn't see you? You think I didn't memorize the way you organize those files, or the way you bite your bottom lip when the Maritime Commission changes their tariff codes? I watched you run my life while pretending I wasn't a monster." "You aren't a monster, Gabriel. You're a businessman who uses blunt instruments." A harsh, humorless laugh escaped his chest. "Don't sanitize what I am to make yourself feel better about working for me. I hurt people. I break things. I ruin everything I touch." He reached out his hand, hovering over the space between them, before he finally closed the gap, his fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. "Which is exactly why I kept my distance. You were clean." Chastity looked down at his large, scarred hand, enveloping her wrist. His skin was warm, rough with calluses from years of holding weapons and gripping steering wheels. It was the hand of a man who built an empire through sheer, uncompromising violence. And now, she asked, lifting her chin to meet his gaze, "Now Romero knows." Gabriel's grip tightened imperceptibly, possessive and grounding. "Which means you don't go anywhere alone. You don't take the subway. You don't get coffee at that place on 4th Street with the broken security camera. You go from your apartment into a car I provide to the office and back." Chastity yanked her arm back. The sudden movement startled him enough to let go. "I will not be put in a cage," she snapped, her eyes blazing. The fear that had been simmering beneath her ribs finally boiled over into anger. "I am your accountant, Gabriel. I manage your legitimate fronts. I do not answer to your cartel rules. If you think for 1 second I am going to live like one of your paranoid lieutenants, jumping at shadows, this isn't a negotiation." Gabriel roared, the sudden volume filling the car, rattling the heavy glass of the windows. He leaned over her, planting one hand on the leather seat beside her hip, caging her in. The scent of him, sharp winter air and burning anger, was intoxicating. "Romero won't come at me with guns," Chastity, Gabriel said, his voice dropping back to a lethal whisper his face inches from hers. He's a snake. He'll find the thing I care about, and he will crush it just to watch me bleed. I am not putting you in a cage to control you. I am putting you in a cage to keep you breathing. Do you understand? Chastity stared into his eyes, seeing the absolute, unfiltered terror hiding just beneath his rage. He wasn't trying to dominate her. He was terrified of losing her. She swallowed hard, the fight draining out of her. I have a life, Gabriel. Not anymore, he said, grimly, leaning back slightly, but not retreating to his side of the car. He kept his eyes locked on hers, the storm in them slowly settling into a cold, hard resolution. Tomorrow I move your desk into my office. The glass door stays locked. Nobody gets to you without going through me first. Chastity turned her face toward the window, watching the blur of the city lights smear into long lines of color. She had wanted him to see her tonight. She had dressed for war, hoping to force him to acknowledge her existence outside the margins of a spreadsheet. She had gotten exactly what she wanted, and it was going to cost her everything. Morning arrived with the bitter chill of a snowless December and a headache that throbbed right behind Chastity's eyes. She walked onto the 32nd floor at exactly 7:30 a.m., dressed in a sharp slate-grey wool suit that buttoned up to her collarbone. The emerald dress was currently wadded up at the bottom of her apartment's trash bin, a casualty of a night she refused to romanticize. The first thing she noticed was her empty desk. The heavy oak workstation that had been her domain for 3 years had been stripped bare. Her monitors, her ergonomic chair, the small potted succulent she kept near the phone, all gone. A hollow rectangular indent in the carpet was the only proof she had ever sat there. Morning, Miss Morales. Chastity turned. Mick, the enforcer who usually guarded the freight elevator, was standing near the lobby doors. He wasn't wearing his usual casual leather jacket. He was in a dark suit, his posture rigid, an earpiece curling behind his ear. He looked like Secret Service. "Where are my things?" Mick Chastity asked, her voice dangerously calm. Mick cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at her. The boss had a crew come in at 4 a.m. Everything was relocated. Inside. He jerked his chin toward the heavy double doors of Gabriel's inner office. Chastity closed her eyes for a brief second, took a deep breath, and marched toward the doors. She didn't knock. She pushed them open, the heavy wood gliding silently on well-oiled hinges. The executive office was massive, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. In the center of the room sat Gabriel's enormous mahogany desk, and exactly 6 feet to the right, angled to face the door, but positioned so Gabriel could see her screens, was her desk. Gabriel was standing by the window, a phone pressed to his ear, a lit cigarette dangling from his free hand. He wore a crisp white shirt, no jacket, the dark ink of the swallow tattoo visible on his forearm. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept at all. He caught her reflection in the glass and turned around, holding up a finger to signal he needed a minute. "I don't care if the union boss is complaining," Gabriel barked into the phone. "Tell him if he delays the offloading by another hour, I'll have Tommy renegotiate his pension plan in the alley behind his house." "Yeah, get it done." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto his desk. He took a drag of his cigarette, watching her as she stood rigid in the doorway. "Good morning," he said, his tone deliberately neutral. "Is this a joke?" Chastity asked, gesturing to her relocated desk. "You actually expect me to work in here? We'll murder each other by noon." "It's not a joke," Gabriel replied, moving toward an ashtray to tap out his cigarette. "And we have bigger problems than office feng shui. Sit down. Boot up your secure drive." Chastity hesitated. The instinct to argue, to demand her independence back, flared hot in her chest, but the grim set of his jaw and the lack of any underlying humor in his voice stopped her. He was in wartime mode. She walked over to her desk, set her bag down, and logged into her computer. The familiar hum of the encrypted server booting up grounded her. What happened? Romero didn't wait, Gabriel said, walking to his own desk and pulling out a file folder, tossing it onto her keyboard. He hit us at 3 a.m. Warehouse, 4 down by the Navy Yard. Burned it to the ground. Chastity's hands froze over the keyboard. Warehouse 4 wasn't a standard holding facility. The electronics shipment, she asked, her mind immediately running the calculations. Gone, Gabriel confirmed softly. 3 million in untraceable hardware turned to slag. But that's not the problem. 3 million is a significant problem. Gabriel? She retorted, pulling the file open. The pages inside were printed photographs, still smelling of chemical smoke, showing the charred skeletal remains of a steel structure. The hardware can be replaced. I have insurance policies on the dummy core that will cover 70% of the loss, he dismissed, leaning his hips against the edge of her desk, forcing her to look up at him. The problem is the message. He didn't steal the hardware. He destroyed it. He's telling the families that I can't protect my own territory. He's baiting you, Chastity said, her analytical mind immediately taking over. She began typing rapidly, pulling up the logistical routes for their upcoming shipments. He wants you to retaliate violently. If you hit one of his casinos or art galleries, you break the syndicate's peace treaty. You'll have the entire commission down your throat. Gabriel looked down at her. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just watched her hands fly over the keyboard, watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration. The raw, violent tension that had gripped him since the previous night seemed to bleed out of him, replaced by a quiet, fierce admiration. Most women would be asking for a bodyguard to take them to the airport right now, he observed quietly. Chastity stopped typing. She looked up at him, the slate grey of her suit making her dark eyes look even deeper. Most women don't know how to launder $3 million through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands before lunch. I am not most women, Gabriel. A genuine, albeit tired, smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a rare expression, one that completely transformed his face from terrifying to devastatingly handsome. No, he agreed, softly reaching out to brush his knuckles against the back of her hand, resting on the mouse. You're not. The touch sent an electric shock up her arm, but she didn't pull away. So Chastity said, clearing her throat and forcing her eyes back to the monitor. How do we hit him back without firing a single bullet? Gabriel leaned over her shoulder, his chest hovering just inches from her back, the scent of tobacco and cedar wrapping around her. He pointed to a specific holding company on her screen. Romero is laundering his casino skims through a commercial real estate firm called Zenith Properties. They're bidding on a city contract next week to develop the waterfront. Gabriel's voice was a dark, conspiratorial purr next to her ear. We're going to bleed their accounts dry. I want you to bury them in audit red tape and freeze their assets. Chastity stared at the screen, a slow, predatory smile touching her own lips. I can flag their offshore accounts to the IRS using an anonymous encrypted relay. It will take the feds 6 months just to untangle the paperwork. Their bid will be dead on arrival. Gabriel let out a low chuckle, a sound that rumbled through his chest and vibrated against her chair. Do it, he commanded. Burn him down, Chastity. From behind a desk. Coffee had become their only shared currency. For 4 days they lived in the perimeter of his office. Chastity slept on the leather Chesterfield sofa for a few hours at a time, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Gabriel had procured from his private quarters while he paced the floorboards or stared out at the harbor. They existed in a strange, suspended state of siege. Chastity typed relentlessly. She navigated the labyrinth of international banking regulations, setting digital tripwires and masking her IP address through a dozen different servers scattered from Zurich to Singapore. She was building a financial guillotine. Gabriel watched her. He had stopped pretending to review his own paperwork 48 hours ago. He simply sat at his massive mahogany desk, nursing a glass of bourbon, and studied the way the blue light from the dual monitors painted her exhausted features. She had abandoned the severe suits for a comfortable cashmere sweater and dark jeans. Her hair was pulled up in a messy knot secured with a pencil. She looked softer, younger, and infinitely more dangerous than any man he employed. "Done," Chastity said. Her voice cracked dry from lack of use. Gabriel sat up straight, setting his glass down. He crossed the 6 feet of carpet between them in 2 strides, leaning over her chair. "Show me," he murmured. Chastity pointed a manicured finger at the screen. A cascading wall of code and red-flagged transaction numbers filled the monitor. Zenith Properties just had their accounts frozen by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I triggered an automated audit protocol based on suspected offshore money laundering. The system automatically locks the assets to prevent capital flight. Their bank routing numbers are effectively dead. Gabriel stared at the screen, a slow, dark satisfaction settling over his features. And the city contract? They missed the escrow deposit deadline 5 minutes ago because their funds are locked, Chastity said, leaning back in her chair and stretching her stiff shoulders. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. Romero is out, and he won't be able to touch that money for at least a year while the feds dig through his fake ledgers. Gabriel didn't move away. He stayed leaning over her, his hands gripping the back of her chair. He looked down at her pale, tired face. The urge to pull her out of that chair and into his arms was a physical ache in his jaw. "You just cost him $40 million, Gabriel said quietly, without leaving a single fingerprint. Chastity opened her eyes, looking up at him. The proximity was startling. She could count the dark lashes framing his storm-grey eyes. "I did my job, Gabriel." Before Gabriel could formulate a response, 3 sharp knocks echoed against the heavy oak doors. Gabriel straightened instantly, the moment shattering. The soft, admiring look vanished, replaced by the cold, hard mask of a boss. "Yeah." The door opened. Mick stood in the threshold, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He was holding a small, square, cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. "Sorry to interrupt, boss. This just came up through the mailroom. It bypassed the usual X-ray scanner because it was flagged as personal courier delivery." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "I didn't order anything." "It's not for you," Mick said, stepping into the room and placing the box on the edge of Gabriel's desk. "It's addressed to Miss Morales." The temperature in the room plummeted. Chastity frowned, pushing her chair back and standing up. "I don't have personal mail sent to the office." "Don't touch it!" Gabriel barked, his voice cracking like a whip. He stepped between Chastity and the box, throwing his arm out to physically block her path. He looked at Mick. "Get the bomb squad in here, now!" "Wait," Chastity said, her analytical mind overriding her fear. She peered around Gabriel's broad shoulder. "Look at the postage weight. It's too light for an explosive device or a chemical dispersant. The courier label is handwritten." Gabriel hesitated, his jaw tight. He pulled a heavy steel letter opener from his desk drawer. "Stand back, Chastity. I mean it." Chastity took 2 steps backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Gabriel approached the box with calculated caution. He used the tip of the letter opener to slice through the packing tape, peeling the brown paper back. He lifted the cardboard flaps. He stared down into the box for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. His shoulders went completely rigid. "Gabriel," Chastity asked, her voice trembling slightly. What is it? Gabriel didn't answer. He reached into the box and pulled out the contents, dropping them onto the pristine glass surface of his desk. First, a piece of melted charred circuit board reeking of chemical accelerant and smoke. A piece of the warehouse Linus Romero had burned down. Second, resting neatly on top of the ruined electronics, was a single flawless strip of emerald green silk. It was exactly the same shade, the same material as the dress Chastity had worn to the Waldorf. Chastity stopped breathing. The message was brutally clear. Romero knew who had frozen his accounts, and he was letting Gabriel know exactly what the price of retaliation would be. Gabriel stared at the green silk. A terrifying, absolute silence fell over him. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. The raw violence that usually lived right beneath his skin didn't explode outward. It inverted, turning cold and dark and utterly lethal. He turned his head, slowly looking at Mick. "Get the cars ready," Gabriel said, his voice a dead, emotionless monotone that terrified Chastity more than any screaming ever could. "Empty the accounts in the floor safes. We leave in 5 minutes." "Where are we going, boss?" Mick asked, his own face pale. "We are going to ground," Gabriel said. He turned to Chastity, his eyes completely hollowed out. "Pack your laptop. Only the laptop." Tires squealed against slick asphalt as the armored SUV took a sharp corner, throwing Chastity against the heavy leather door panel. She didn't complain. She gripped her laptop bag to her chest, like a shield staring straight ahead at the partition. Gabriel sat beside her, radiating a kinetic, terrifying energy. He had a Glock 19 resting on his thigh, his thumb rhythmically flicking the safety on and off. Click, clack, click, clack. It was the only sound in the vehicle. They had driven for 45 minutes, weaving through industrial parks and decaying suburban sprawls, making sure they had no tail. Chastity had no idea where they were. The car finally jerked to a halt in an underground parking garage that smelled of damp concrete and motor oil. Gabriel shoved his gun into his shoulder holster and opened his door before the driver had even put the vehicle in park. "Move," Gabriel ordered, grabbing Chastity's elbow and practically dragging her out of the SUV. He didn't take her to a luxury penthouse or a fortified compound. He led her up a concrete stairwell to the 3rd floor of a nondescript brick apartment building. The hallway smelled like boiled cabbage and cheap detergent. Gabriel unlocked a heavy steel door with 3 separate deadbolts, pushing her inside and slamming it shut behind them. The apartment was a ghost town. It was immaculately clean, but completely devoid of personality. A cheap brown sofa sat in the living room, facing a blank wall. The kitchen consisted of a mini-fridge and a microwave. The blinds on the single window were drawn tight and taped to the frame. Gabriel immediately began pacing the perimeter, checking the locks, peeking through the edges of the blinds, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. Chastity dropped her laptop bag onto the small kitchen counter. The adrenaline that had carried her out of the office was crashing, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill of the unheated apartment. "How did he know?" Chastity asked, her voice echoing loudly in the sterile space. "I used 7 proxy servers. I encrypted the digital signatures. There is no mathematical way Romero traced that IRS flag back to me." Gabriel stopped pacing. He stood in the center of the living room, running both hands over his face, pressing his palms against his eyes, as if trying to physically force his brain to stop spinning. "He didn't trace the code, Chastity," Gabriel said, his voice ragged. He dropped his hands and looked at her. "He traced the motive. Nobody in my organization hits from behind a keyboard. I break bones. I burn buildings. The financial hit, the clean surgical strike that crippled his empire, he knew that wasn't me. He knew exactly who engineered it." Chastity swallowed hard. "The green silk. He was letting me know that he sees you. Gabriel stepped closer, his boots heavy on the cheap laminate floor. He was letting me know that if I take his money, he takes my... He choked on the word, unable to finish the sentence. Your what, Gabriel? Chastity demanded, her frustration finally bubbling over. She closed the distance between them, refusing to back down. Your employee, your asset, your favorite calculator. Stop. Gabriel warned, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. No, I won't stop, Chastity yelled, pushing at his chest. It was like pushing a brick wall, but she didn't care. I told you that night at the Waldorf that you were painting a target on my back. You paraded your possession in front of a psychopath, and now I am standing in a bleak safe house, waiting for a bullet. Gabriel caught her wrists, stopping her frantic assault. He didn't squeeze hard enough to hurt her, but his grip was ironclad. He pulled her against him, eliminating the space between them. You think I did that to mark my territory? Gabriel asked, his breath hitting her face, his eyes blazing with a desperate, naked truth. You think I wanted anyone in this God-forsaken city to know you exist? Then why? Chastity whispered, the fight draining out of her at the sheer intensity of his gaze. Why did you make a scene? Why did you ruin everything? Because I couldn't watch him touch you for one more second. Gabriel practically shouted the words, the confession tearing out of his throat. He dropped her wrists, his hands flying up to cup her face, his thumbs rough against her cheekbones. Because I have spent 3 years suffocating in that office, listening to you breathe, watching you walk away from me every night, and forcing myself to keep my hands off you so you could stay clean. Chastity stared up at him, her heart stopping in her chest. You aren't a spreadsheet. Chastity. Gabriel whispered, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. He was trembling. The brutal, untouchable king of the city was shaking like a leaf. You are the only good thing I have ever known, and the thought of Linus Romero or anyone else taking you away from me, it broke me. I broke my own rules. I exposed you. And it's my fault. Chastity closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of his hands. The cynicism she wore like a shield fractured completely. She had spent years telling herself he was just a boss, just a dangerous man she worked for. But standing in this cold, empty room, listening to the terrified heartbeat of a monster who loved her, she knew the truth. She opened her eyes, looking into the storm-grey depths of his. Then fix it. Chastity breathed softly. Gabriel let out a ragged groan. He didn't ask for permission. He tilted her face up and brought his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was an explosion of 3 years of repressed, agonizing restraint. It was desperate bruising and entirely consuming. Chastity gripped the lapels of his shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, answering hunger. The cold of the safe house vanished, replaced by the blistering heat of his hands sliding down her back, pulling her flush against his chest. He tasted like bourbon nicotine and raw panic. Chastity tasted like salvation. Gabriel walked her backward until her spine hit the wall, pinning her there, deepening the kiss, until neither of them could breathe. He kissed her like a man starving to death who had finally been given a feast. When he finally pulled away, resting his forehead against hers again, they were both gasping for air. I'm going to kill him. Gabriel promised, his voice a dark, lethal whisper against her lips. I am going to rip Romero apart for putting that silk in a box and threatening you. Chastity looked at him, her eyes dark and heavy. The accountant was gone. The woman standing in front of him was fully immersed in his world now. Don't just kill him, Chastity said, her voice steady and ruthlessly cold. Take everything he owns first. I know where the rest of his offshore accounts are. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, casting long, bruised shadows across the cheap laminate floor of the safe house. Chastity barely heard the harsh electrical hum. Her entire world had narrowed to the glowing 13-inch perimeter of her laptop screen. Keys clattered in rapid rhythmic succession. She wasn't just moving numbers across a digital ledger. She was erasing a man's legacy. Gabriel leaned against the small kitchen counter, next to her nursing a black coffee in a dented styrofoam cup. He had spent the last 3 hours on an encrypted burner phone, systematically pulling his enforcers off the streets. He had ordered total suffocating silence. No retaliation strikes. No drive-by warnings. No broken bones. He was letting the syndicates think he was hiding. He was letting Linus Romero feel the intoxicating, dangerous high of victory. He uses a private routing firm in Geneva to mask the casino profits before they hit his domestic fronts. Chastity said, her voice dry, not breaking her focus on the cascading lines of code. It's layered behind 3 shell corporations, standard Russian nesting doll structure. I need 10 minutes to bypass the secondary firewall without triggering their internal security alarms. Take 20, Gabriel murmured. He set his coffee down and stepped closer. He reached out his rough knuckles, brushing a stray, exhausted lock of dark hair away from her cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle, an agonizing contrast to the cold, lethal work she was executing. He thinks he has time. Let him sleep. Chastity nodded, her eyes darting across the screen. She found the back door in the Geneva servers. Romero was arrogant. He relied on expensive, flashy security software, but had failed to mandate changes to the core decryption protocols of his holding companies. It was a lazy, bureaucratic mistake. It was fatal. She executed the bypass command. The screen flashed a muted, validating green. I'm in the main artery. She breathed, her posture stiffening. Gabriel moved directly behind her. He placed his heavy hands on her shoulders, his thumbs pressing firmly into the knotted tension at the base of her neck. The heat of his palms grounded her. It was a physical anchor in the middle of a swirling digital storm. Empty him out, Gabriel ordered softly. Chastity didn't hesitate. She didn't transfer the funds to Gabriel's accounts that would leave a digital fingerprint the feds could trace back to Mercer Holdings. Instead, she took Romero's empire and scattered it to the wind. She routed $20 million into anonymous offshore charitable trusts located in jurisdictions with no extradition treaties. She locked another $15 million in a tangled bureaucratic web of international tax flags that would take forensic accountants a decade to untangle. She cancelled his standing vendor orders, defaulted on his international high-interest loans, and wiped his private operational ledger completely clean. In less than 45 minutes, Linus Romero went from a billionaire untouchable to a man who couldn't afford to pay his own electric bill. It's done, Chastity whispered. She pulled her hands away from the keyboard, dropping them into her lap. Her fingers were trembling with the adrenaline crash. Gabriel stared over her shoulder at the screen. The master account balances all read 0. A terrifying, beautiful silence settled over the sterile apartment. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat or pump his fist. He simply looked down at the woman sitting in front of him, realizing the absolute terrifying magnitude of her capability. He won't know yet, Gabriel said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble near her ear. His accountants won't check the offshore balances until the morning shift. He still thinks he's hunting us. What happens when he finds out? Chastity asked, turning her chair slowly to face him. The commission happens, Gabriel replied flatly. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers, ignoring the strain in his knees. Romero owes money to people far worse and far less patient than me. Cartels, corrupt politicians, union bosses. When his payroll checks bounce tomorrow morning, I won't have to fire a single bullet. They will tear him apart for me. Chastity swallowed hard. The reality of the violence she had just orchestrated settled heavy in her chest. She hadn't pulled a trigger, she hadn't swung a baseball bat, but she had undoubtedly signed Linus Romero's death warrant. Gabriel saw the shadow of hesitation cross her eyes. He reached out, cupping her face with both hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, firm and reassuring, wiping away the creeping doubt. "You survived," Gabriel told her fiercely, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers, demanding her full attention. "He put a target on your back. He sent that silk to threaten the only thing in this world I care about. And you survived. Do not waste a single second of guilt on a man who would have put a bullet in your head without blinking." Chastity leaned into his calloused hands. The brutal, cynical honesty in his words was exactly what she needed. She wasn't just a secretary hiding behind a mahogany door anymore. She was a partner in a very dark, very real world. "I don't feel guilty," Chastity said, her voice steadying, hardening into steel. She held his gaze. "I just want to know what happens to us now." Gabriel let out a ragged breath. He pulled her forward out of the chair, wrapping his arms securely around her waist, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He breathed her in the scent of vanilla cold air and ozone. "We leave this apartment," Gabriel promised, his voice vibrating against her skin. "We go home, and you never ever sit at that desk outside my door again." Morning broke over the city skyline like a shattered mirror, grey cold and razor-sharp. Linus Romero sat in the private VIP lounge of his flagship downtown casino, swirling a glass of 20-year-old scotch. The leather armchair was soft, the room was perfectly climate-controlled, and he felt entirely untouchable. He had burned Gabriel Mercer's warehouse to the ground and sent a clear, terrifying message straight to the man's desk. Mercer was hiding in a hole. The ports would be Linus's by the end of the week. His phone rang. It wasn't his standard business line. It was the encrypted satellite phone reserved strictly for his lead accountant. Linus answered, irritated by the interruption of his victory lap. "This better be important." "Mr. Romero." The accountant's voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with absolute, uncontrolled panic. "Sir, the accounts, the Geneva routing numbers, the holding companies." "Spit it out," Linus snapped, sitting forward, the scotch sloshing over the crystal rim of his glass. "They're gone, sir. All of them." Linus froze. The expensive liquor suddenly tasted like battery acid in his throat. "What the hell do you mean? Gone, it's $40 million. Money doesn't just vanish into thin air. It's been completely liquidated, dispersed to untraceable blind trusts. IRS red flags are simultaneously locking down all of our domestic fronts. So the commission, the monthly operational payments to the cartel are due at noon today. The accounts are completely empty. We are bouncing checks." The heavy phone slipped from Linus's hand, clattering loudly against the glass coffee table. He stood up, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He turned toward the heavy oak doors of the lounge, intent on finding his security chief, intent on locking down the building. Before he could take a single step, the doors swung open. Gabriel Mercer stood in the threshold. He wasn't flanked by his usual squad of heavily armed enforcers. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wore a crisp, tailored black suit, a heavy charcoal overcoat, and a look of absolute, terrifying calm. Linus stumbled backward, his hand flying instinctively to the shoulder holster beneath his velvet jacket. "I wouldn't bother," Gabriel said. He stepped fully into the room, letting the heavy doors click shut behind him. "Your men in the lobby are currently packing the trunks of their cars. They got a call 5 minutes ago from their union rep saying your payroll accounts evaporated. Loyalty is an expensive commodity, Linus. You can't afford it anymore." Linus pulled his gun anyway, aiming the barrel squarely at Gabriel's chest. His hand was shaking so violently, the front sight blurred. "You think you won? You think a cheap computer trick makes you a king?" Gabriel didn't flinch. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet, stopping just 10 feet away from the barrel of the loaded gun. He looked at Linus, not with the burning anger of a rival, but with the cold, detached pity reserved for roadkill. "I didn't beat you, Linus," Gabriel said, his voice barely rising above a conversational whisper. "I barely lifted a finger." "Then who?" Linus demanded, his voice cracking the panic finally bleeding through his polished facade. "The woman you tried to use as a pawn," Gabriel answered. A dark, ferociously proud smile finally touched the corners of his mouth. "You looked at Chastity and saw leverage. You saw a weakness you could exploit. You didn't realize you were looking at the architect of your own ruin." Linus stared at him, the crushing reality of his situation crashing down on his shoulders. He was a dead man walking. The cartel would be kicking down his door by lunch. The commission would strip his remaining physical assets to pay off his debts. He had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. "Shoot me," Gabriel offered calmly, spreading his arms, slightly exposing his chest. "Put a bullet in my heart. It won't bring your money back. It won't stop the people who are coming for you right now. You are a ghost, Linus. You just haven't realized you're dead yet." Linus's hand trembled violently. The gun felt infinitely heavy, dragging his arm down. He looked at Gabriel, the blue-collar street dog he had desperately underestimated, and then looked down at his own empty, shaking hands. The gun slipped from his grip, clattering uselessly to the floor. Gabriel didn't say another word. He turned his back on the ruined king and walked out the door, leaving Linus to the wolves. The penthouse office of Mercer Holdings was quiet, wrapped in the steady, familiar hum of the HVAC system. Chastity stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling harbor. The winter sun had finally broken through the heavy cloud cover, casting a brilliant golden light across the dark, churning water of the Atlantic. She wore a tailored black suit, sharp and unyielding, her dark hair falling loosely down her back. The heavy wooden doors clicked open. Gabriel stepped inside. He looked physically exhausted, the shadows under his eyes dark and heavy, but the suffocating violent tension that had gripped him for days was completely gone. He took off his overcoat, tossing it carelessly over the back of a leather chair. He walked across the expansive room, coming up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back, flush against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, closing his eyes and letting out a long, deeply contented sigh. "It's done," Gabriel murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the skin just beneath her jaw. "The commission seized his casino an hour ago. He's finished." Chastity leaned back into his solid warmth, resting her hands over his where they clasped at her stomach. "And you?" "I'm exactly where I want to be," Gabriel answered. He gently turned her around in his arms, framing her face with his large, calloused hands. He looked deeply into her eyes, seeing the brilliant, dangerous, irreplaceable woman he loved. "Though I am going to need to hire a new secretary." Chastity smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached all the way to her dark eyes. "Good luck finding one. I hear the boss is a nightmare, and the hours are terrible." Gabriel let out a rough, gravelly laugh, pulling her in for a slow, breathtaking kiss. The city buzzed far beneath them, violent, cynical, and chaotic, but inside the glass walls of the penthouse, the ledger was finally balanced. If you felt the intense heat and tension of Chastity and Gabriel's story, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button right now to show your support for raw, grounded Mafia romance that breaks the clichés. Want more dangerous power dynamics, brilliant heroines, and fiercely protective bosses who would burn the world for the women they love. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. Who do you think is the real mastermind? Chastity or Gabriel? Share this video with a friend. Let's grow this community together.